Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. You've probably seen by now the scenes of chaos or heard the stories of desperation coming out of Afghanistan. People rushing the airport in Kabul and running alongside military planes as they're taking off and even clinging on to them, doing whatever they can to get out of the country now that the Taliban are back in power. The last time the group ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, they did it with an extremely strict version of Shariah law. Women couldn't work or leave the house without a male escort. Criminals were punished by stonings, amputations, and public executions. Music, TV, and cinema were banned, and other religious practices weren't tolerated. But the Taliban say this time will be different. In their first press conference, spokesman Zabihullah Mujahid presented a softer, friendlier face for the movement.
Women will be afforded all their rights, whether it is in work or other activities, because women are a key part of society. And we are guaranteeing all their rights within the limits of Islam.
The militant group also said Afghans who had worked with the U.S. and allied forces as translators or in similar roles had a home within the new regime.
As for their talents and their skills, we do not want them to leave the country. We want them to serve their own homeland.
But many of those who experienced life under the Taliban the first time aren't buying it.
That traumatic experience of the Afghans is still very fresh in their memories. And that's why they're worried and scared of Taliban right now. That's why there's an exodus of people to Kabul airport.
My guest is Sher Jan Ahmadzai. He's an expert in Afghan governance, having himself worked for the Karzai government. He's now the director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at the University of Nebraska Omaha. And we're going to talk about how the Taliban managed to push past Afghan forces and take over the country so quickly, how they've changed since they were last in power, and what Taliban control looks like in 2021. You're listening to The Decibel. Hello, Sher Jan. Thank you so much for doing this. I know it's an incredibly busy time, so I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here with you.
So can we start with a basic question, which is who the Taliban are? Can you remind us who makes up this group and what their ideology is?
A Taliban movement came to existence in early 1994-93, a very indigenous movement in southern Afghanistan, southwestern Afghanistan, in Kandahar, under Mullah Umar, which was against the chaotic scenes and the civil war and the problems created by the warlords, the insecurity created by the warlords for the people of a village in Kandahar. But when it gained momentum and popularity, it was hijacked by Pakistani ISI for their strategic interests and security reasons.
Sorry, so just for our listeners, the ISI is Pakistan's intelligence service, kind of like CSIS or the FBI.
They offered them support, and they almost totally controlled the direction of this movement from that time. And that played very well for ISI. Taliban movement got powerful. They started to control more territory. Initially, they did not have the goal of military violence at all. They were just there for getting rid of the warlords so people could live in relative peace and security. But when they gained momentum, they had guns and many people joined in with the same initial cause, but the background of support this time was different from another intelligence agency. They started to gain more ground and popularity among the common Afghans. And in a few years, in 1996, they captured Kabul city, the capital of Afghanistan. Almost 94% of the country was captured, just like they are right now, except Panjshir province, which was not under their control then and even now. Their full control in Afghanistan created absence of war. People really welcomed them into their cities. However, that welcome did not last long, or I would say that image of Taliban did not last long because of their very harsh implementation of Sharia law, the way they were implementing it. And people did not have the liberties, very basic stuff, not even basic services. Public schools, even public health were not organized by government of that time. People were punished brutally. Their heads were chopped off, their hands were chopped. Women were executed publicly in the public. Well, women could not walk out without a family relative. So all those restrictions provided an environment where there was no war, but it was not a peace. People were not at peace. People were under constant fear. It was just like a peace in a graveyard.
Yeah.
In the meantime, there were other groups from around the world. All of them started to have bases in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And that resulted in 9/11. When 9/11 happened, unfortunately, the United States had to go back and topple that government of Taliban. And that went on for 20 years till 2 days ago.
Right.
But the question is, where did Taliban go when their government collapsed? Actually, they went back. They went to Pakistan. They started to regroup in the city of Peshawar, and more importantly, headquartered in the city of Quetta. The leadership is still there. And that's how they staged a very successful insurgency.
So people have been shocked by how quickly the Taliban pushed past Afghan forces. The U.S. had been training Afghan forces for years at the cost of billions of dollars. And can you talk about how the Taliban managed to pull this off and essentially put themselves in government?
The United States suddenly decided to withdraw forces from Afghanistan. And the way they negotiated the Doha deal with Taliban completely undermined the legitimacy and morale of the Afghan government and the state itself. The very government the United States had been supporting for the last 20 years, when the United States went into direct negotiations with Taliban rather than the Afghan government. That's one factor. The second factor is when the United States pulled the forces suddenly before the scheduled date, the Afghan forces who were dependent on air support from the U.S. planes, they lost that leverage. Mm-hmm. The air support was not just used to attack Taliban, but also to maintain supplies to Afghan army, to evacuate their wounded, to help them with their logistics. That support was gone. You know, we hear in the media, the Afghan army had these planes and all those things. Why did they get defeated? Well, guess what? More than 50,000 American contractors were maintaining those planes. They were all pulled out. Mm-hmm. So when you don't have that support, how do you continue a fight?
What was the approach that the Taliban took as they approached the capital? Like I've read about the negotiations that they had with local officials and leaders and how they got them to surrender. How did they do that?
Yes, most of those deals were not with the army, but most of those deals with political leaders in the provinces, mm-hmm. the civilian administration, rather than the army, that as far as I know. Like the provincial district governors, provincial governors, the deals were with them. And you know what? If a soldier sees a civilian leader striking a deal with Taliban, what kind of moral support does that give to a soldier? So that also affected soldiers abandoning their posts.
So essentially, it sounds like since the 2020 deal between the Taliban and the U.S., the Taliban became emboldened and morale among the Afghan forces plummeted.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And so can you talk about the difference between the Taliban that ruled Afghanistan in the 90s versus the group that we are seeing now?
So the Taliban who ruled Afghanistan in the 90s was so brutal that the Kabul city had become a ghost town. I remember many neighborhoods of Kabul. I mean, it was after the Civil War. Many neighborhoods of Kabul after 6 were ghost towns. Nobody could venture out in those neighborhoods. They were already destroyed, but nobody lived in those places. Mm-hmm. So it was very quiet. And they were so brutalized, the very harsh interpretation of Sharia law and the way they were treating the people with no services to be offered to the public. That traumatic experience of the Afghans is still very fresh in their memories. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're worried and scared of Taliban right now. That's why there's an exodus of people to Kabul airport. But as Taliban claim right now, they're different, they have changed. That has not been proven yet. Mm-hmm. There are incidents in Kabul in Afghanistan right now that contradicts the claims. In Jalalabad, there were demonstrations by the young people to preserve the national flag of Afghanistan, not to be replaced by the white flag of Taliban. And there were civilians killed. And there were generals beaten. So when people see those things, that reminds them of the harsh memories they had in the past, and they taking away the freedom of expression, the freedom of gathering, when you see those things happening in Afghanistan. So all these things and many other incidents that happened, like knocking at the doors of people, previous government officials, asking them where they are, I was reading tweets of previous officials, a few of them. They say, Taliban came to my house, and they destroyed stuff in my house, and they took documents and stuff from my house.
Right. And this contradicts the claims that the Taliban have been making to the world that they are now much more moderate.
Yes, it is yet to be proved. It is yet to be proved, those claims. I think we should judge them by their actions, not words.
Right. And can you talk about what they've claimed about who they are now?
Well, they claim that we respect women's rights, we respect education rights for women, we respect an inclusive government, which the previous government was not inclusive at all. Everybody else was out of the government. So all those things are yet to be seen.
Yeah, I read in a piece that you wrote, I think a few weeks ago for The Conversation, that there are reports of Taliban rulers asking families to marry off one girl per family to fighters, ordering men to pray, grow beards.
Yes.
So it doesn't seem like much has changed contrary to what they're saying.
Those were the reports from northeastern Afghanistan, the province of Badakhshan in Takhar, where they captured almost 3 weeks ago or a month ago.
So what do you make of this idea of a reformed Taliban and the image that they're trying to project to the world? Why are they doing that?
I'm not going to buy that image yet. As I said before, we're going to judge them by their actions rather than by their words.
Why do you think they are trying to project this image of themselves?
Because they have seen the international community does not accept those things. More importantly, the Afghans are not accepting those things. When you see Taliban trying to control a demonstration, this is a huge challenge for them. There were demonstrations in Khost province for national flag. There was demonstration in Nangarhar province for national flag. This is a challenge. In their third day of gaining power, people are rising against their efforts to replace the national flag with the white flag they have for their faction. For the last 20 years, Afghanistan has had a new generation of young people, both girls and boys. Those who were born a few months or a few years ago before 9/11, and those who were born after 9/11. This generation has seen the world. This generation has enjoyed the right of electing leaders. This generation has enjoyed the right of gathering. This generation has seen the right of demonstration and expression and journalism, and the right of saying stuff without remorse or without worry. They're not going to stand for the values if you shut them up, and if you put them in prison, if you kill them for what they say. They're going to demonstrate. This is a different generation. At the same time, Taliban also have a generation of fighters who were not exposed to all these things I just talked about, who were exposed only to what their teachers and their members who they were surrounded with, who lived in rural villages of Afghanistan, who lived in camps in Pakistan, who lived in madrasas, most of them who lived in madrasas, who only had seen and learned from their leaders of the Kabul government is infidel, they're infidels. Well, actually, the Kabul government was made up of Muslims and everybody else. On both sides, we have two new generations of people. But right now, majority of Afghans are standing up against some of the things the Taliban are doing. It's going to be a huge test for Taliban leadership, how they can provide services when the international aid is drying out, when Afghan currency is depreciating. It's going to be inflation. There's going to be people complaining. And that's going to be a challenge for them too, because their leaders said, it's going to be a test for us to how we can offer services to Afghan people. When if you don't have assistance from the international community, you cannot provide them services. People are going to go hungry and they're going to come after you.
So how much of the leadership or the people who were part of the Taliban back in the 90s are now part of the leadership or still part of the organization?
Almost everyone.
Almost everyone. And they do have a new leader, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. Can you tell me about him and what he's like?
He was the second person under Mullah Omar, very famous among Taliban. He was arrested in Pakistan in 2009 or 2010 by a Pakistani establishment with support of the United States, although he was put in prison until 2018 before he was released and sent to Doha, Qatar. And right now he is the political leader of Taliban. I know they have a supreme leader, which nobody has heard from for the last few months, almost a year. And nobody knows if he is alive or dead.
Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said, we are not going to recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. They're still listed as a terrorist group here. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a decision Prime Minister Trudeau made based on Canadian laws, and I think that's the best decision he could make for his country. But I could echo the words that he said. It was an elected government of Afghanistan that was toppled. There was a peace process going on to transition to an administration that could facilitate election, that process was sabotaged by whatever factors there were. I mean, that does not provide legitimacy to the current Taliban regime in Kabul.
Mm-hmm. The fact that we're not recognizing the Taliban as a government, is that going to make it more difficult for us to get people out of there who want to escape? It might,
but the goal is not short term here. The goal is not just to evacuate people who work with us. That is the current goal, to help those people who work with us. But the bigger goal is for the 36 million people in Afghanistan who aspire for the same values every Canadian wants to enjoy or live by. So for that, I think it is necessary to apply such pressures so that all those gains made in the last 20 years with Canada's help, United States' help, should be maintained and preserved in Afghanistan.
So in contrast, we've seen China's indicated that it accepts the Taliban's takeover as, quote, the choice of the people. Do you expect any country will recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government?
Even Pakistan is rethinking, is split whether to recognize the current government in Afghanistan or not, because they know the consequences of doing so, because the rest of the international community is yet to step up and say, we recognize Taliban government, because there is no government right now. It's a chaos. There are people in control of different administrative buildings, but there is no leader right now. There is a vacuum of leadership. You talked about China. China's relationship with Afghanistan right now is very transactional. They don't care what Taliban do inside Afghanistan as long as their economic benefits are sustained.
Okay, so what do you think Afghanistan's future looks like in the short term?
Well, it's going to be bleak, unfortunately, because the recent, it's the third or fourth day. If you judge the future and if you base the prediction on what has been the performance of Taliban in the last 4 days, it's going to be very bleak. Unfortunately, the economic aid would drain out, economic conditions would worsen, and that would result in security conditions getting worse because people would be fed up, and there will be more poverty and disappointment among the population of Afghanistan.
And long term, what do you think the Taliban's goals are in the country?
I think the Talibans have to realize that they cannot live by the codes that they used to have. They have to live with the new Afghanistan that has been made in the last 20 years if they want to stay relevant to what Afghanistan is right now, which is the Afghans want elections. Afghans want preserving of national values, including the flag. Afghan wants freedom of expression, freedom of gathering, freedom of electing leaders, all the freedoms that they enjoyed in the last 20 years.
Okay, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. Rebecca Weston is our intern, David Crosby edits the show, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks to Sher Jan Ahmadzai. He's the director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at the University of Nebraska Omaha. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. We always want to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.